an Architecture Media podcast, supported by the Australian Institute of Architects, produced on Boonwurrung country.
Welcome to Design Speaks Weekly, a podcast that explores the biggest stories in Australian architecture and design. I'm your host, Georgia Burks, and today, Katelin Butler, Editorial Director at Architecture Media, speaks with Neil Durbach, Camilla Block and David Jaggers, the recipients of the Australian Institute of Architects 2026 Gold Medal, Australia's highest architectural honour. But first, here's Architecture AU with the latest headlines. In the news this week, Neil Durbach, Camilla Block and David Jaggers have been named the Australian Institute of Architects 2026 Gold Medalists. The jury praised the directors of Durbach Block Jaggers Architects for creating architecture that is intellectually rigorous, deeply affecting and profoundly civic across almost 3 decades. And the Western Australian Government has announced that it's developing a housing pattern book to accelerate the delivery of housing in established suburbs. The $2 million initiative, which is estimated to take 2 years, will involve the development of architect-designed homes suited to medium-density infill projects. Those are the headlines for this week. For the full stories and more news, visit architectureau.com. I'm Adair Winder. It's Tuesday, May 19. Sydney-based practice Durbach Block Jaggers Architects is defined by a collaborative exploratory approach to design that embraces complexity, contradiction and exchange. In celebration of their gold medal win, Editorial Director at Architecture Media Katelin Butler speaks with Neil Durbach, Camilla Block and David Jaggers about collaboration, creative process and the dynamics behind their practice.
So Neil, Camilla and David, thank you for joining us on Design Speaks Weekly. And again, congratulations for being the 2026 gold medalists. Now, Neil, I'm going to start with you because it's you that often talks about the philosopher Isaiah Berlin's analogy of the hedgehog and the fox, where the hedgehog relates everything to one central vision and the fox pursues many ideas, often contradictory ones. You've described yourself and those in your practice as foxes. What does this way of thinking actually look like in design?
Honestly, we've always been interested in these two polarities in architecture, which is Miss and Corb. And Miss was the kind of guy who perfected the work slowly over time, whereas Corb, in a sense, got bored, I think, and jumped around exploring different things in the way that Picasso did, whereas Braque was much more of a hedgehog. Picasso was like very interested in changing things. And I don't know whether that's because he was, or Corb, or we are bored, get bored quickly, or whether there's an attention problem. But it seems that to redo things in architecture needs to come some sort of stasis a little bit. And I think we've always been inspired by trying to explore new things always and kind of troubled by repeating things.
The fox is comfortable with holding contradictions simultaneously, so complexity, ambiguity, even an inconsistency. In architecture, where there's often pressure for clarity and resolution, how do you protect space for uncertainty, intuition or discovery within the design process?
The stronger the strategy is, the looser the response can be, I think. It's almost like once you've got a very clear structure, the freedom exists to play and explore other things within it.
I think it's a really good question about space for ambiguity because design is an open-ended process and people have to trust you that it isn't all sorted out on day one. You're not presenting something that's in a finished form on day one. And so there is a huge exercise in trust, I think, with the people that you're taking along for the ride. And yes, I think that is a real challenge of our profession. It's much easier to say, okay, buy a Volvo, you know what it looks like. But if you're designing it as you go and as the complexity of the project or the constraints of it get fed into that process, you have to be quite agile and able to change, but at the same time preserve something kind of like a guiding hand. Yeah, it's tricky. Yeah. It's an interesting
But I also think
question.
That, like, the consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. It's always been something that I've been kind of fascinated by.
Who actually said that?
I think it was
Sounds like Winston Churchill.
No, it was the guy from Walden. Anyway, but I find control in design or over control quite terrifying. I feel sort of suffocated by things being too perfect. And I think you need that looseness. But if everything's sort of anarchic, it's that I find that equally sort of unsettling. So it's this fine balance of not being constrained by what you do, that there's a kind of relaxed quality about the work, but it's not sort of all over the show that you just think, God, I just don't know what's going on here.
And I guess that allows you to roll with the punches of design.
Yeah.
There's lots of hurdles in design, and I guess if you've got that flexibility innate in the process, then you're like, oh well, we'll just adapt to this. New
but it's a fine line between agility and just being kind of a jelly.
Or dogmatic, which is also kind of equally sort of annoying, I think, in design.
David, architecture today involves navigating an enormous amount of compliance, procurement and technical constraint. How do you protect moments of delight or emotional resonance through all of that complexity?
That's a very good question. I don't know. I think it's really tough. And I think it's tough no matter what the project is, from a house to a big public project. But I think in the end there's a few things. One is you need to bring everyone sort of along. So you've got to sort of somehow get builders, consultants, clients to sort of share the vision of what you're trying to create. And I think the other thing is you've got to sort of constantly adapt and understand what are the key elements of the design that need to hold and what can maybe be let go, so that at the end you don't end up with like the loading dock with a perfect array of services aligned, but the key part of the design under-realised. So it's sort of, it's bringing everyone along to say, yeah, look, that's important, but this is the key thing. So it's, and obviously when there's 300 people involved in the project, that's much harder than if it's just a client and a few other people. So it generally is, I think, an easier process, say, with a house than it is with a larger project.
I think that's exactly right. It's like, where do you put the energy and how do you, the work itself is not hard, challenging, but the work itself is actually easy, I think, compared to what Dave was just describing. The sort of politics of leadership are very tough on projects, and they become more and more so.
Yeah, I think it goes to the discussion about the hedgehog and the fox, because I think, or to Neil's initial response about the strategy, that once the idea is right, then you have room to kind of, when they come back and say, we need to cut this much out of the budget, you can sort of move. No, you can be agile because you know what the strategy is and what the key things are. And it's obviously harder if that the strategy gets compromised, then you sort of almost got to go back to square one. But I think that sort of approach allows you to sort of adapt.
I'm going to talk about the dynamic of the three of you now. From my experience, the dynamic is sophisticated yet always playful, as I think we've experienced already in this episode. There's deep thinking underpinning the work and a rich understanding of many art forms. But there's always a sense of cheekiness to discover in the finished projects. Camilla, can you talk a bit about the particular qualities that each of the three of you bring to the work?
The three of us, we don't have really distinct areas of expertise. We don't have like particular skills that we only focus on. We're sort of quite rubbery in that way. And as Dave once said, we take turns to be reasonable. But I do think that Dave has this incredible kind of equanimity that it really is that stability that sometimes underpins. Neil might be slightly crazier than me.
Slightly.
I just think that in a way, like, we cycle through so much. We've worked together for so long. We have a kind of shorthand. That means I think we can cover a lot of ground quite quickly, and it can be quite bruising as a process, and it can be really funny, and it can be, but we kind of get there quite quickly if the three of us are all focused on it. And that kind of dynamic conversation, as you say, is really hard to say, well, this person has that role or that person has this role. But Neil is like an incredible source of he can just keep going. Like, he's a sort of iterator, a master iterator. He can just work. If you say, have 12 ideas for that, he can have 50. So I think that combination of feeding that fire between sort of equanimity and sort of input is part of how we do it. I think it's hard to articulate.
But I think it's also because, collaboration's a big issue these days, but we've always collaborated. And collaboration now is often a very sort of careful way of interacting, whereas our office collaboration is kind of brutal. And actually that's always led to really interesting ideas, always. I think it's the almost a kind of reckless idea about who's leading the thing that makes them really interesting projects. And so it's quite bruising. Like if Camilla says that's a terrible idea, then I'm going to find reasons why it's not. You know what I mean? And I'll find more reasons why it's a really good idea until we sort of find that Dave says, actually, both of you are wrong. Why don't we do this? And it's a much more playful way of working because it's sort of serious, but it's kind of...
It's sort of freeing.
It's kind of critically kind of weird.
And it is really like that. Like you can walk past someone's computer and go, oh.
Yeah. And nobody gets freaked out.
Yeah, there's
what
a real
is
directness.
that?
Yeah. There's a real culture of just saying what you
Whereas
think.
actually I think what you're saying is that collaboration now is very much like everybody's voice is heard and everybody's kind of, it's all equal. But that's actually, we're focused on what are we going to produce through that collaboration. We're not designing the collaboration. And I think that that's a slightly contentious idea.
It's a very contentious idea now because everybody treads so carefully that sometimes you end up with this camel because you don't want to really hurt anybody. But that's not an easy way of working often. It's sort of people think, oh, not again.
There is that idea that critique drives innovation. So if you're not kind of looking at things with a critical eye, how are we going to progress the way we produce architecture? So I think that critical feedback loop is really important and you can see it in your work.
But it's never personal. It's always about the work. I mean, I think we adore each other sufficiently. That
there's obviously that deep respect for one another.
Yeah. So it's always like, no, that's a really bad idea. I can't stand what you're doing. See you tomorrow.
Have a nice evening.
That's right.
That's lovely. So the three of you seem to operate less like a traditional hierarchy and more like an ongoing conversation, which we've sort of been talking about. David, how do disagreements function within the studio? Are they productive?
I think the key thing is that the ambition is for the work. So, and I think to drive that along and to push it forward, you've got to have these conversations. And actually, we were just talking about how it feels like the broader architectural conversation, maybe it's just in Sydney, kind of has evaporated. And to some extent, we feel like you've got to keep that bigger conversation going in the office, but you've also got to keep a conversation about the work. And I think the process of the studio where a lot of ideas are explored in models and that model's there for everyone to look at and everyone to sort of feed in their ideas about the design or pushing that design forward. And I think obviously, I think even though we're all pushing sort of in the same direction with an ambition for the work, you go away and think about it and even though you think you're all pushing in the same direction, you all sort of start drifting off into space in your own idea of what that should be and then come back together and sometimes those things aren't aligned and you've got to talk it through. And I think, following on from what we just said, it can be bruising, but it's not a personal thing, but you put forward your idea or case and you argue it robustly, like it's a really robust discussion, but you're not going to, in the end, you have to sort of think, well, what's the best thing for the project? And that's what you settle on. So I think that helps work and drives it forward because it's like you don't ever settle on, design's about possibility. And if you don't explore possibility, then if you're a hedgehog and you just think this is the right idea, then it's kind of easier, but it's not going to necessarily have the same richness maybe.
I think there is a resistance to change now. I think either it sort of slows things down and people get like, oh, what's going on here? Whereas I think we encouraged, well, I certainly, the next morning you come back and think, oh, God, that was all terrible. What about this thing? And then you start again and you've got to have a sort of a group of people that go with it instead of going, oh, no, not again, not another change. Because I think that does happen a lot. It destabilizes the thing, but I don't think so. I think it's important to be able to sort of say that was all rubbish and start again.
Obviously, you guys have worked together for a really long time, so have been collaborating for a long time in this way. You often work with other practices in collaborations. How does that work? How do they kind of respond to your approach to collaboration?
I'm saying I think that's the difficulty, that we're so used to working in this sort of unedited way about the work, can be politically quite complicated. But there are people that enjoy that way of working as well. I mean, like working with Wardle's always been incredibly easy and fun. And I think the sense of humour that we have about the work and about working, about each other, we find in other people makes that journey incredibly pleasant and pleasurable and exciting. You know, that you're always thinking of what's possible or new. Or
so you have to choose the right collaborators, I guess. It's the right
well,
personality fit
but
as well.
architecture has always been a collaboration with other professions.
That's true.
So we've had amazing collaborations with other consultants who have a different expertise to us. So an amazing collaboration with engineers, landscape architects. Those are relatively easy collaborations because everybody has their own field and you're relying on an interaction of those fields. I think the difficulty arises when you collaborate with other people in your own field, and then you've got to really be clear, like, what are we doing together? Why are we doing it together? Where are the boundaries of our roles or our sites? And that's why our relationship with Wardle, with John, was so amazing on Phoenix, because we each had our own site and then we agreed on a shared facade and a shared courtyard where the project came together. And I think that just made it effortless. And it was a little bit like the extension of our relationship internally, because you can say anything to John and John could say anything to us. And it was actually really helpful. It was like having another voice in that conversation. And that was an amazing collaboration. And that's always the dream, that is the purpose of collaborating with other architects in your own field. But it doesn't always happen and it can be quite troubled.
Neil, if the hedgehog knows one big thing and the fox knows many things, what are the many things architects should be paying attention to right now beyond architecture itself?
you know, I think we sort of buffeted with so much stuff these days. Like, it's kind of relentless. I sometimes feel eroded by it. You know, you're sort of surrounded by so many ideas all the time that actually it can be quite destabilizing. You kind of lose your sense. And I do think for architects there was that interest in trying to absorb everything. You were like the sponge, but the older I get, the sort of more I think you should be much more concentrated in what you are trying to do, and that the influences are often just architectural. You know, Lucan said that, you know, you can understand the whole world through a blade of grass. And I always thought that was quite an interesting way of thinking about influences. That actually sometimes just focusing on the thing that you're really interested in is the most inspiring thing. And that all the other stuff is fascinating, but it kind of fades away, I think, in the face of making real architecture.
I think it's a depth versus breadth discussion. And, you know, closest I ever came to being cancelled was when I said we should stop sitting in rooms talking about problems that we actually cannot solve and start talking about what is our real skill. Like the idea that, the question was very clear, like beyond architecture itself. Yes. I think unless we focus on architecture itself as our starting point, we're just in a massive world of distraction and false expertise, dare I say. We can't solve climate change. We can't solve, you know.
It doesn't mean that you're oblivious to it.
And that they're not important issues.
Then they're not crucial things in the world. Yeah,
but if they come at the expense of valuing our real skills as architects, then I think we're in trouble. But as I said, I got nearly cancelled for saying that.
Yeah. But as Werner Herzog says, do the doable. And actually I think that's quite an interesting thing about working. Don't take on things that you can't solve. I mean, I do think that the interesting things have happened, like this recent political changes to ideas about housing and tax and all that. Is amazing that it's happened, you know. But that's something that architects can't really drive, I think.
I was listening to Kenneth Frampton recently, and he sort of said, he talked on this topic where he said, actually, really the the political role of architecture is to ensure that architecture remains relevant to society. That's the overarching political role. All the other political distractions are just that, and they're not really driving architecture forward. And I think that's so true, that actually architecture has its own responsibility, and focusing on that, I think, is the most important thing.
But it doesn't mean that you're immune to all those, to everything.
You're aware of it,
totally.
Obviously. Yeah.
And actually the weirdest things can filter through and start to influence the work. And actually it's not that you're deliberate about it. It's not like this sort of deliberate way of working. It's a much more intuitive thing that starts to infect or effect the work.
How can we make architecture remain relevant? I guess that's the big question, isn't it? In what Kenneth Frampton talked about, that's a question that everyone's talking about in the industry at the moment. Do you have any answers to that big question?
I do think that there's this sort of omni-poly crisis around being relevant for architects. And actually you sort of swerve off into weird sort of ways of thinking about architecture that sometimes goes against the whole idea of making beautiful. Because people are very scared to talk about beautiful spaces and incredibly pleasurable things. And actually, that's a really crucial part of what we do. It's not necessarily just solving problems. I think architecture does have this sort of poetic sort of ambition. And that's sometimes lost in the causes. Or as my friend Harry says, in like trying to get rid of your guilt, that you sort of focus on things that have got very little to do with the essential nature of architecture.
But also, actually, one of the most terrifying things I've heard recently in the field of architecture is that projects intentionally look cheap, so they don't look like they've wasted public money.
Yes, you'll spare no expense to look cheap.
Yeah, and I think, wow, like architecture used to be a centre of ambition and longevity and courage and optimism. And now it's like, don't worry, we didn't waste your money on this crap. Get another garage, like go for it. And I find that really...
But it doesn't mean that we're interested in excess or redundant stuff or any, I think we genuinely live quite modestly, I think, for architects. And that's our genuine interest, is that there's no redundancy or excess or sort of pretension to the work. I think that's something we really are resistant to.
Yeah, and I guess there's, a strong case, obviously, for longevity in architecture, to your point, Camilla, just thinking about, designing buildings that people want to care for and look after over time and so that they remain here for a really long time. That's obviously really important in terms of environmental sustainability as well, and
totally.
Thinking about, so there's different ways to think about it, I think. It's not just one way. That brings us to our last question for today, and it's a question that we ask all of our guests. That is kind of what we've been talking about, this kind of growth mindset. What is something that you've recently changed your mind about? I'll start with you, David.
Following from our conversation, you can see we change our mind all the time. In fact, changing your mind is kind of key to the process. I mean, Neil sort of...
Well, it's the fox.
Neil has,
the
to
fox
quote
mentality.
Neil, what's the point of having a mind if you can't change it? That's Neil's line.
Very true.
No, but I think Camilla also said that sometimes, and it's irritating, I think, that my indecision is final. And
I love that quote.
That's part of being a fox, isn't it? If you can't change your mind, then you're a hedgehog. You're just following one train. So,
But sometimes I try and be the stabilizer. Like I think, no, we're good. This is where we are is good. But every day I have to learn to be happy about changing my mind again, changing my mind about changing my mind. And then sometimes we go back to that stabilizing point, like we loop the loop and we come back, and then I do have that. You see, you should have listened to me 6 months ago.
That's an important thing that you can, somebody, says that sometimes the first idea is the best idea, but actually sometimes it's the journey to get back to that. That's
Well, you're
first of all, it's
testing
really
all of the
interesting.
alternatives to
Yes.
make sure that that's the best idea.
T.S. Eliot
thing,
line.
and
What is
the
that?
end is our beginning, and that you come back to that thing, but you need to go through that journey because I otherwise it can be a stillborn exercise,
I think that's a good way to end our episode today. So Neil, Camilla and David, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Caitlin.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode, which is supported by the Australian Institute of Architects. If you're enjoying this podcast, be sure to subscribe, share, or leave a rating. I'm Georgia Burks, and this has been Design Speaks Weekly. Design Speaks Weekly is produced on Boonwurrung country. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters, and culture.